Minnesota Territory, 1874. Every settler in the valley was racing to seal their cabins before frost hit. And there was Nora Kearn, a Scottish widow hauling river clay from the creek bed in a wooden bucket, one load at a time. 3 weeks running. Her neighbors had long since finished their chinking with the standard mud and hay method, the way any reasonable person on the frontier would. A few handfuls shoved into the gaps between logs, smoothed flat, left to dry. Done. 2 weeks of honest work, maybe 3 if a man fussed over the corners. Nora had been working her walls for 11 weeks straight. And she wasn't filling gaps. She was constructing something no one around her had ever seen. 8 inches of river clay, blended with crushed stone and dried grass, packed between an inner board and the outer log face. Pressed by hand in dense lifts, tamped with a flat-headed mallet, sealed with fresh clay at every joint, left to cure, slow, in the September air before another layer went on top. The whole operation looked magnificently pointless to anyone passing by, which was everybody, and they all made sure she knew it. Men shook their heads, women clucked their disapproval. Old Garrett Foss, who'd been working that stretch of Minnesota river bottom since before half his neighbors could grow a beard, reined his horse at her fence line one Tuesday afternoon in late September. He watched her work for a solid minute without a word. Then he spoke. "Nora, winter doesn't care how pretty your walls are." He rode off. She kept tamping. What Nora Kearn knew about stone and clay and the slow, patient way dense material holds heat, knowledge drawn from a lifetime in the Scottish Highlands, where blackhouses had been raised on this same principle for 4 centuries, was about to be proven in the most brutal and undeniable fashion the Minnesota frontier could deliver. January of 1875 brought a cold snap so vicious it froze the river solid in 3 days. Livestock died in barns their owners had considered perfectly sound. Cabin temperatures plunged below freezing in homes where families had been feeding fires without pause for a week straight. Nora Kearn let her fire burn down to coals at midnight. She slept through the coldest night of the decade, never added a single log. When she opened her eyes at dawn, her bread dough, set out to rise the evening before, had done exactly what bread dough does. Her walls were still radiating every degree of heat she had ever given them. 14 hours since the last real fire. Her cabin sat warmer than most of her neighbors' homes had been at the height of their burning. What she grasped about thermal mass, about heat storage, about the difference between blocking cold and holding warmth. Modern building science would spend the next 100 years wrestling into equations what one widowed Scotswoman had worked out with her hands, her memory, and a creek full of perfect clay. Nora Kearn reached Minnesota Territory in the spring of 1873. 3 children, 1 ox, a cast-iron pot, and the kind of composure that only grows from surviving things that would have shattered most people completely. Her husband, Duncan Kearn, had crossed from Glasgow the year before to scout the land and file the claim. He'd been dead of cholera 6 months before she arrived, buried somewhere near St. Paul by strangers who'd known him barely 2 weeks. The land agent who passed her the claim papers looked mildly surprised she meant to go through with it. She thanked him, asked directions to the nearest mill. 38 years old, 5 feet 4 inches of controlled practicality, reddish-brown hair pulled back so tight her children had never once seen it down. She spoke with a Highland accent that rounded her consonants and sometimes puzzled her neighbors. They mistook her careful, measured way of speaking for uncertainty. It was not uncertainty, it was precision. Nora did not say things she didn't mean. She made no promises she couldn't honor, and she did not, under any circumstances, raise a wall she hadn't thought all the way through. She had 3 children. Ewan, 12, carried his father's height and his mother's seriousness in equal measure. Elspeth, 9, had inherited neither trait and remained cheerful about the absence of both. Little Callum, 6. He'd been young enough during the ocean crossing that Scotland existed for him only as a word other people used. Minnesota was simply the world. He met it with uncomplicated enthusiasm. They were capable children. This was fortunate. A widowed homesteader's children had no choice but capability. Nora made this plain from the start. Everyone worked. Everyone bore weight. Callum could not yet bear much, so he bore what his small frame allowed, and grew fast enough that his contribution improved with every passing season. The land agent who passed her the claim papers did so with a studied blankness. Nora recognized it later for what it was, the expression of a man wrestling with whether to voice something discouraging. He chose silence. This was professionally wise. Nora had already resolved not to be discouraged, and any attempt at warning would have produced an unpleasant exchange for both parties. She thanked him, took the papers, walked out into the street. Hall, mourning with 3 children trailing behind her, and the focused intensity of a woman who had converted grief into forward motion and had no intention of letting it reverse. The claim occupied a bend of the Crow River in territory that would eventually organize itself as Wright County. Rolling terrain, gentle in its contours, good bottomland soil, hardwood timber enough for building. A creek running south of the property where the current slowed at the bank curves, and there, in those curves, excellent clay deposits sat exposed. Nora noticed the clay on her 3rd morning. She had not yet chosen where to site the cabin. She crouched in her boots at the exposed bank and pressed her thumb into it. Gray-blue, dense, the kind that holds shape when rolled between fingers, the kind that dries hard as fired pottery under open sun. She knew it instantly, because she had spent her girlhood watching her father press this same material into the cracked outer walls of the family Blackhouse outside Ullapool. Walls that were, in places, more than 3 feet thick. Those walls, rubble stone and packed earth, compressed into a heavy, dense mass beneath a turf layer, did not fight cold the way a thin, tight barrier fights wind. They did something stranger, something more powerful. They absorbed heat, slowly. Over hours, over days of fire burning inside, the mass of stone and compacted earth drew warmth into itself the way a cast iron skillet draws heat from a stove, deep into its core, until the material itself was warm through and through. And then, when the fire died or the storm struck, those walls did not simply go cold. They released stored warmth back, gradually, steadily, over 12 hours, sometimes 16, radiating heat into the interior long after any flame had gone dark. Highland winters were brutal. The Blackhouses survived them, not by repelling the cold, but by storing enough warmth to outlast it. Nora had lived her first 18 years inside one of those houses. She understood exactly what her thumb was touching in that Minnesota riverbank clay. The black house she grew up in, perched on a hillside 2 miles from Ullapool, its face turned toward the prevailing westerly wind with a resignation that the building community of Minnesota would have found deeply unrelatable. It was not beautiful by any external standard, a long, low form of rubble stone and compacted earth, walls so thick they resembled less a human construction and more geology that had arranged itself into a rectangular opinion about shelter. The interior ran dark and smoky by any modern measure. A central hearth burned peat the way Highland fires had always burned, filling the upper air with haze that drifted upward until it found its way through a gap in the thatch. The floor was packed earth over stone, swept each day, replaced when it wore through. One door, low-framed. No windows in any conventional sense, only gaps that could be stuffed with peat or cloth when the weather turned vicious. By every standard the Minnesota settlement would have applied in 1874, this house was primitive. By the only measure that truly counted on January nights, when the Atlantic hurled sleet horizontal across the hillside and the temperature plunged into territory that could kill, by that measure, the Blackhouse was a triumph of thermal engineering. Those walls, 3 feet thick at their densest, absorbed heat from the constant fire all day long. They released it slowly through the night and into the next morning. They carried a full day's worth of burning through a full night's worth of sleeping without anyone needing to rise and feed the flames. Nora's mother had banked that hearth every evening of Nora's childhood. Every morning, she woke to walls still warm enough for bread to rise against them. The house was not comfortable in any soft or modern sense. It was warm in the survivable sense. A different thing entirely, a more important thing. The cabin she raised that first summer followed standard frontier logic in its bones. Pine logs notched at the corners in the usual fashion. A single main room with a sleeping loft above for the children. A stone and clay fireplace set along the north wall. A door facing east to catch first light. Her neighbor too claims north. A German farmer named Rolf Vetter came to help raise the walls in August. He brought 2 of his sons and a borrowed cant hook. They finished in a day and a half with the brisk competence of men who had done this a dozen times before. He told her she could have the chinking complete within 2 weeks if she started Monday morning and didn't overthink it. He was not wrong in general terms. Most settlers finished in 2 weeks. Nora was not most settlers. She let the logs sit for 2 full weeks first, watching, studying the places where they shifted as the green wood dried, marking the gaps that changed size and shape with the settling. She was still watching when Rolf rode past in early September and noticed she had not yet started chinking. He said nothing directly, because Rolf Vetter was a decent man, but his silence carried a weight that was itself a kind of comment. When she finally began, it was not with mud and hay. The method she had devised over those 2 weeks of careful observation started at the creek. She dug clay from the bank where it ran cleanest, in the smooth curves. She loaded her wooden bucket and hauled it back to the cabin, 20 minutes each direction. Her 12-year-old son Ewan joined her after the first week. They fell into a rhythm, Ewan hauling, Nora mixing. She blended the raw clay with 2 parts crushed stone, flat-sided fragments she had knocked off the granite field stones quarried for the fireplace foundation. 1 part dried grass, cut short. She worked the 3 materials together in a wooden trough with a measure of water until the consistency sat somewhere between bread dough and mortar, dense enough to hold its shape when pressed into place, plastic enough to conform to every irregularity in the log surface without cracking as it cured. But before she pressed a single handful of this mixture into the wall, she built the inner form. Against the interior face of each log, she nailed rough-sawn pine boards onto simple ledges. A second surface set roughly 8 inches inside the log face. This created a cavity between the board and the exterior wall. She was not filling gaps, she was filling a deliberate space. The clay-stone mixture went in from the top, pressed down by hand in layers she called lifts. Each lift about 4 inches deep, each one tamped firm with a flat mallet before the next was added. She worked from the bottom of each cavity to the top. It took her 11 weeks. 11 weeks. This is the number that shattered the comprehension of nearly everyone in the settlement. 11 weeks of dawn to dusk labor on every day that fieldwork did not claim her. Ewan carrying clay. Her younger daughter Elspeth mixing material in the trough. The neighbors tracked the calendar with that particular disbelief frontier communities saved for people who spent time on things that did not obviously require doing. Garrett Foss paid his Tuesday visit in late September and offered his opinion regarding winter's indifference to beautiful walls. Rolf Vetter came by in early October. He studied the work. He looked at Nora. He studied the work again. And very carefully, he said that she had certainly done a thorough job. His wife, Marta, carried less restraint to the weekly gathering. She wondered aloud whether Nora had perhaps confused thoroughness with stubbornness. The woman beside her let out a quiet laugh. Nora, across the room, chose not to hear it. Then there was the matter of her doing this alone. A woman. The settlement found it simultaneously impressive and faintly unsettling. A widow staking her own claim, acceptable, even admirable. But a widow who seemed to understand things about construction that the men around her did not. That was harder to place. Garrett Foss had raised 6 cabins across Minnesota. Rolf Vetter had raised 4. Neither man had ever encountered the idea of packing crushed stone and clay into a cavity wall. And the fact that a Scotswoman, freshly arrived, was doing it with quiet certainty made them uneasy in ways they couldn't quite name. The unease came out as dismissal. That was simpler. The schoolmaster, a young man from Connecticut called Aldous Grant, who'd arrived the year before, carrying a teaching certificate and an extraordinary volume of opinions, stopped at Nora's fence one afternoon. He asked whether she had any empirical basis for her building method. Nora laid out the Blackhouse tradition in 3 sentences. Aldous listened with care. Then he informed her that anecdotal historical practice could not substitute for established engineering principles. This was technically correct, in the same way that telling a fish its gills lack formal recognition as a respiratory mechanism is technically correct, accurate, impressive-sounding, and utterly beside the point. She thanked him for his perspective, went back to tamping. He rode off wearing the expression of a man who has delivered vital information and cannot fathom why it failed to land. The remark from the settlement that stayed with Nora, if she was honest, came from a woman named Jean Brunt. Jean's husband had built what everyone acknowledged as the finest cabin in the Gerd Valley. Square-hewn logs, tight chinking, real glass in the south-facing window. 2 rooms and a sleeping loft. Jean wasn't cruel, but she possessed the particular confidence of a woman married to the settlement's best builder. One afternoon she turned to Nora with genuine puzzlement. "Won't all that clay just crack when the cold hits and fall right out?" A perfectly fair question. Nora answered it with the patience she reserved for fair questions asked in the tone of foregone conclusions. "Only if it's packed wrong," she said, "and only if it hasn't cured before the freeze." Jean weighed this a moment. "Well, I suppose you'd know." Her voice suggested Nora might not know at all, but that contradicting a woman mid-mallet swing seemed impolite. "What's the matter with regular chinking?" Garrett asked one October morning. He stood watching her drive a fresh lift of clay into the south wall cavity. "Nothing's the matter with it," Nora said.
She didn't pause.
Quote 7, quote 8. She laid her palm flat against the dried section she'd finished 2 weeks prior. "This holds warmth inside. There's a difference." Garrett turned the thought over, found nothing to say to it. Left. What Nora was constructing carried a name in the language of modern materials science, a name no one on the Minnesota frontier in 1874 had yet encountered: thermal mass. The principle is straightforward enough to explain, but counterintuitive enough to catch people off guard the first time they meet it. Most methods for keeping a building warm focus on resistance: blocking wind, sealing gaps, stopping cold from pushing through. Conventional insulation slows the migration of heat from warm interior to frigid exterior. It builds a barrier that fights thermal movement. Standard frontier chinking did precisely this. It closed the cracks, cut infiltration, gave the fire a fighting chance against outside air.
But resistance and storage
Are not the same strategy. A thin, sealed wall resists cold while flame burns. When that fire dies, the resistance remains, but nothing stands behind it. Interior air cools fast, because air holds almost no heat at all. It warms in a rush and surrenders that warmth just as quickly, climbing upward, slipping through every crack, vanishing the instant the source goes cold. What Nora was constructing was something else entirely: a reservoir. Heavy materials, stone, packed clay, mineral-dense composites possess what physicists call high specific heat capacity. They accept thermal energy reluctantly, absorbing it over long hours of sustained heating. But the same law works in reverse. They surrender that energy just as slowly. The heat lives inside the mass itself, not in the air hovering before it. When the fire dies, the wall does not go cold. It gives back what it stored, gradually, steadily, hour after hour. The way a hearthstone, pulled from coals and tucked beneath blankets, keeps a sleeping body warm long after the last flame has flickered out. The river clay Nora packed into her walls carried thermal properties she understood not from books or lectures, but from a lifetime of touching, lifting, pressing, decades of tactile knowing that no formal study could replace. Wet clay conducts heat well during the absorption phase. It draws thermal energy in readily, spreading it through its entire mass. Once dried and compressed, that same clay transforms into a slow-release store, surrendering its captured warmth at a gentle, measured rate that holds interior temperature steady long after the external fire has gone dark. The crushed granite she folded into the mixture added weight and pushed storage capacity higher still. Stone holds roughly double the thermal energy of wood per unit volume. The dried grass woven through gave the composite enough internal scaffolding to resist cracking as it cured. The identical role straw had played in the earthen walls of Scottish blackhouses for centuries. The 8-inch cavity she filled was not ornamental. It was calculated. 8 inches of dense clay stone composite, once brought to full temperature by a sustained fire, could hold enough stored warmth to keep an interior livable for 12 to 16 hours after the heat source went silent. Nora had never quantified this with instruments or numbers on paper. She had grown up in a house where it simply happened, and she trusted what her own body had felt on bitter mornings in Ullapool. Her neighbors trusted what they had built. Standard mud and hay chinking, pressed thin between logs, an inch thick at its most generous, dried to something with the thermal performance of stiff paper. It stopped wind acceptably on calm nights. It did considerably less when conditions turned. The first real sign that the settlement was approaching a winter worth remembering arrived in early December. The temperature plunged to 22 below zero and stayed there for 4 consecutive days. Most old-timers called it a cold snap rather than a storm. No wind, no snow, just a bone-white stillness that lowered itself over the river valley like a breath held too long. Garrett Foss burned through 2 full cords of wood in those 4 days, roughly double his expected rate for the season. He woke every morning to frost crystallized on interior wall surfaces near the windows, despite fires he had fed without pause around the clock. His wife, Bet, told the women at the church social that she had taken to sleeping in her coat. She said it flat, matter of fact, the tone of someone who had been doing it a full week and had moved past embarrassment into simple endurance. The Vetters fared no better. Rolf was a methodical man who had calculated his wood stores against a conservative winter estimate, and now stood before his shrinking stacks with the face of someone running numbers whose answer he already dreaded. His cabin was well made by every accepted standard. Tight corners, good chinking, a proper door seal. The cold penetrated anyway, the way extreme cold penetrates any single thin barrier of any material. Steadily, relentlessly, 1 degree at a time. Eventually, the fire's output and the cold's advance met in equilibrium at a temperature barely above survival. Nora burned roughly 1/3 of what her neighbors consumed during those same 4 days. Her walls had been curing since October, 2 full months absorbing the relatively gentle autumn temperatures, settling into a thermally stable state. When she lit her fires in November and held them constant, the claystone mass began its slow, patient accumulation of stored warmth. By December, those walls held warmth, not just at their inner face, but deep through the full 8 inches of packed cavity. They had absorbed enough heat to give back something real, not merely resisting the cold, but actively pushing against it. The difference showed most in her floor. Packed earth underfoot stayed warmer than it had any right to, the wall bases radiating stored heat downward into the ground at the room's edges. Her children padded barefoot across that floor on winter mornings. The Vetter children, Marta mentioned, pulled on every layer they owned before their feet touched the ground. Nora said nothing about this, but she noticed. What came in January of 1875 was not a storm. There was no blizzard to speak of, no drifts swallowing windows, no visible spectacle for neighbors to discuss afterward. What descended on the night of January 14th was pure cold. An immense body of Arctic air slid down from the north and settled over the river valley so completely that the people beneath it experienced it less as weather than as a permanent alteration of the world itself. The thermometer, hanging outside Garrett Foss's cabin, showed 36 below zero at first light on January 15th. By noon, the mercury had not budged. By the next dawn, it read 38 below, the coldest any settler in the community had ever recorded during their years on the claim. The air hung perfectly motionless. No wind, no snow, no spectacle at all. Just cold so deep and so patient that wood fires began to feel like polite suggestions made by people who had not yet grasped the scale of the opposition. The sky turned that particular blue which only appears when the air carries almost no moisture. A hard, luminous, pitiless blue. Beautiful, the way a flooding river is beautiful. Striking from a distance. Deadly at arm's length. Chimney smoke climbed in straight vertical columns through the still air, which was the one piece of theatre that extreme Arctic cold allows, and which made the settlement look, from a distance, like a painting. A dozen white lines ruled against that merciless sky, each one a family feeding wood to a fire that was barely holding ground. Inside the Foss cabin, Bet had moved the water pail to within 3 feet of the stove the night before, draped a cloth over it. By morning, a thick crust of ice sealed the top. She cracked it with a spoon before she could pour. She had seen water freeze in the cabin before, in previous hard winters, near the door, never near the stove. That stove was burning oak she had split in October, good, seasoned hardwood. The cast iron glowed dull red at the firebox door. It was running that hot. The cold was winning anyway. The problem with extreme cold of this motionless, settled kind is that it strips away the difference between a structure that blocks wind and a structure that truly holds warmth. When cold rides on wind, the fight is about infiltration, sealing gaps, stopping moving air from stealing heat. But when the cold simply exists, still and total, the fight becomes purely about thermal resistance and storage. How much heat can the walls absorb? How long can they hold it? How efficiently does their mass bank the energy the fire puts in? And here, thin chinking and single-layer log walls showed their fundamental weakness with an honesty no amount of skilled carpentry could conceal. Log walls on their own carry modest thermal mass. Wood is less dense than stone or packed clay, lower specific heat. It warms fast, but surrenders that warmth just as readily. A well-sealed log cabin in moderate cold holds a livable temperature through tight joints and relentless fire tending. At 38 below, sustained across 48 hours, that balance collapsed. Wood pulled cold from the exterior face, conducted it inward, and radiated it into the living space. A process that demanded enormous, constant fuel just to hold the line. Families were not heating their homes. They were locked in a relentless war against the cold, and the cold was winning on fuel. Garrett Foss tore through his last 3 cords in 48 hours. He hadn't prepared for this. No one in the settlement had. His original stockpile had looked generous against any winter a reasonable person could expect. By the morning of January 16th, he was ripping apart fence rails and feeding them to the stove with the calm precision of a man who'd already accepted the fence would need rebuilding come spring, and that spring meant nothing if his family froze before it arrived. The glass thermometer hanging on a nail near the center of his room read 17 degrees at dawn. His fire had burned through the entire night. The walls returned nothing. They had nothing to return. Mud and hay chinking packed between logs, maybe 3/4 of an inch at its thickest, had never accumulated any real thermal mass, no matter how long the fires ran. Bet Foss was not a woman who panicked. She was not a woman who exaggerated. She sent her eldest boy trudging through the snow to the Vetters with a note. 5 words. Quote, 10. The Vetter boy came back carrying a reply. 2 words. Quote, 11. Both families had retreated to the smallest corners of their cabins, feeding anything burnable into their stoves, watching their own breath hang in the air 3 feet from the flames. The third family in the nearest cluster of claims, Daniel and Clara Whitmore, with their 2 small children, had come from Ohio the previous spring. Daniel had built what he called a solid cabin. Structurally, he was right. Thermally, it performed like a neatly stacked pile of frozen lumber. Clara's youngest, May, 3 years old, had started coughing in the night, a tight, barking, croupy sound. Clara knew that sound. It was the sound of a child pulling air colder than any 3-year-old's lungs should handle. She wrapped the girl in every blanket she owned, pressed her close to the stove, and felt, for the first time since she'd chosen to follow her husband west, a fear that was not distant, not theoretical, real, immediate. Sitting in her arms, Nora Kearn's cabin on the morning of January 16th held at 47 degrees. She had let her fire sink to banked coals around midnight. Not dead, just reduced to a settled ember bed that wouldn't demand attention until well past dawn. She'd done this on purpose, partly because exhaustion had ground her down, partly because she wanted to know. She'd been curious about this since October. How warm would her walls hold? For how long? Under a genuine test. Her father had once told her, about something else entirely, that the colder the winter, the better the data. She'd filed that principle away and kept it. She had spent 18 years in that black house outside Ullapool. She carried a reasonable expectation of what dense clay walls could do. She had never, until this winter, faced conditions brutal enough to test it. By midnight, after a full day of fire, her walls had been drinking heat for 11 weeks. They were as warm as packed clay stone gets. Warm at the surface, warm through the middle layers, warm deep into the 8-inch cavity. They carried enough stored thermal energy to actively contribute to the temperature inside, not merely failing to oppose the cold, but pushing back against it. When the fire dropped to coals, the walls didn't flinch. They kept radiating that banked warmth inward, slow, even, invisible. Not the dramatic blast of a roaring fire. The quiet, reliable warmth of a stone that has been resting near a hearth all afternoon. Not hot, but not cold. Not bargaining with you about whether it planned to keep working, just steadily releasing what it had stored the energy to hold. She woke at 6 in the morning, 14 hours since the fire had last been properly fed. Her breath was not quite visible. The thermometer on a nail near the center of the south wall read 47 degrees. Outside, the thermometer nailed to the post read 38 below. The gap between those two numbers stretched across 85 degrees. Every single one of them had been pressed into the walls by her own hands, one scoop of clay at a time. 11 weeks of labor the settlement had observed with puzzled politeness and gentle condescension. The bread dough she'd placed in the warmest corner the night before had risen perfectly by morning. Yeast performs exactly as yeast should when the air around it holds steady within a livable range. That does not happen inside a cabin where the temperature has cratered below 40, while a family sleeps. She registered this with a quiet, private satisfaction. Then she coaxed the fire back from its coals. Not frantically, not with the raw desperation of someone dragging warmth back from the brink. With the unhurried efficiency of a woman who understood the crisis had already been handled, and the fire was a gesture toward comfort, not a defense against death. Then she glanced through the small, south-facing window and saw no smoke rising from Garrett Foss's chimney. At 6 in the morning, in 38 below, that was not a small thing to notice. She brought soup. This is the detail everyone who retold the story afterward held on to, and it reveals something exact about Nora Kearn.
she did not simply bring herself.
She set a pot of potato and salt beef broth over the fire to warm, while she bundled her children and laced her boots. She carried it across the snow, wrapped in cloth, with the steady ease of a woman who had decided soup was required and had simply gone ahead and made it. Garrett Foss answered his own door when she knocked. He looked like a man who had spent the night watching hope contract. Past his shoulder, the interior of his cabin was visibly dark, visibly cold, the kind of space that forms when a fire has been losing its war against the walls for 2 days running. That sat near the stove beneath a coat and 2 quilts, and the expression that crossed her face when she saw Nora holding that pot was something no one would have tried to put into words. Nora brought both families back to her cabin. 3 trips through the snow, moving children, carrying the Whitmore baby. None of it dramatic, none of it ceremonial. She looked at the situation, concluded there was room enough, and began moving people. By 9 that morning, she had Garrett and Bet Foss, Rolf and Marta Vetter with their 4 children, Daniel and Clara Whitmore with their 2 daughters, 11 souls altogether, inside a cabin holding at 51 degrees. The fire rebuilt to a proper burn, the temperature climbing toward its usual range without any rush. May Whitmore's croup eased within an hour of breathing that warm, steady air. The child's breathing loosened from the tight, labored rhythm Clara had spent the whole night tracking, settling into something closer to normal. By noon, she was asleep in a corner. The deep, unhurried sleep of a small body that has finally stopped fighting. What the adults felt inside that cabin over the next 24 hours ran deeper than physical warmth. It was the particular shift that moves through a mind when a body held in crisis for 2 days is finally given permission to let go. Garrett Foss, who had not sat down without springing back up for 48 hours, lowered himself into Nora's chair beside the fire. He did not move for an hour. He did not speak. He sat in the warmth, the way a person sinks into water after long cold, completely, with a surrender that is also a kind of rescue. Marta Vetter, not a woman anyone would have called sentimental, wept briefly and quietly into a cloth. Then she composed herself and began helping Elspeth manage the children. That is what practical women do with feeling once they have finished briefly allowing it. Rolf Vetter lowered himself to the floor, his back pressed against Nora's south wall. After a few moments, he reached behind him, laid his palm flat against the surface. "That wall is warm," he said. His voice carried the tone of a man reporting something he cannot yet fully explain. "Yes," Nora said. "All the way through?" "All the way through." He held his hand there a long while. Feeling something he had been told for 11 weeks was foolish excess, something that was now making its own case far more convincingly than any argument she could ever have offered. He finally raised his eyes to her with the look of a man who has reached the border of his own knowledge and is absorbing that fact honestly, without pride getting in the way. What settled onto his face was something near true respect. Not politeness, which costs nothing, but the slower thing that must be earned. Ewan, watching from the corner where he sat among the Vetter children, saw this and understood something he could not yet name. He had spent 11 weeks carrying clay from the creek in a wooden bucket, one load at a time, because that was what the work demanded. He had been 12 years old, pressing clay into wall cavities in the dying light of evening, while other boys had long finished their tasks and moved on to easier things.
He had never complained about it,
Beyond what was practical, because his mother had not raised him to waste breath on necessary labor. And he had been old enough to sense, even without clarity, that whatever she was constructing deserved constructing, even if he could never have explained this to the other boys. He had simply trusted her, the way children trust parents who have proven themselves worthy of trust. He looked at Rolf's hand, pressed flat against the wall. He looked at the Whitmore baby sleeping in the corner, breathing evenly for the first time in 2 weeks. He looked at his mother, portioning soup into cups for 11 people, with the same measured steadiness she carried into everything. Moving through her own crowded house, like someone who had always known she would end up exactly here. Then he returned to his task, keeping the Vetter children busy, and said nothing. But something that had been taking shape inside him across 11 weeks of hauling clay had completed itself. He knew without speaking it that the work had been right, and that some kinds of rightness need time before they show themselves. The physics behind what Nora's walls accomplished had a clarity anyone could understand once they pressed a hand to the surface and felt it. Stone and dense clay absorb and hold heat in proportion to their mass, not merely their surface area, not merely the air temperature surrounding them, but their actual physical weight and density. A single pound of dry granite stores roughly 0.19 British thermal units of heat for every degree Fahrenheit its temperature climbs. Clay falls slightly lower, around 0.16 BTUs per pound per degree. Neither figure sounds remarkable alone. But Nora's walls, in their completed form, held somewhere between 800 and 1,000 pounds of clay-stone composite per section. Heated to a sustained interior equilibrium through weeks of ordinary fire use, those walls had banked a thermal charge that gave them effective heat output lasting deep into the following day. This is the difference between high-mass construction and high-resistance construction. Resistance performs while the heat source burns. Mass performs when it stops. They guard against different failures entirely. A thin, tightly sealed wall that blocks cold efficiently still collapses the moment fuel runs out, or the fire tender falls asleep, or someone gives up at 3 in the morning. A mass wall, dense, heavy, saturated with warmth, keeps radiating whether anyone feeds the fire or not. The failure that killed settlers in extreme cold was never inadequate flame or poor sealing. It was the gap between when the fire could no longer be sustained and when the sun returned. Mass walls close that gap by banking warmth inside the physical body of the building itself, making heat independent of the fire's moment-to-moment life. Nora had never used these terms to explain what she was doing. She would have described it the way her father did. The wall holds the fire's memory. When you bank the coals and sleep, the wall keeps working. The wall is the fire that does not need tending. She had grown up inside that truth long before she had theory for it, which is perhaps why she trusted it more deeply than neighbors who had been told the same thing second-hand.
They found it impossible to believe
Until they felt it beneath their palm, on a night when the thermometer read 38 below and their children's breath hung white in the air. Garrett Foss felt it first. He was the first to ask about the construction. He did not ask immediately. He waited until the crisis had passed and the families had gone back to their own claims, which happened on January 19th when the cold broke enough for travel. He appeared at Nora's door 3 days later, carrying a notebook borrowed from Aldous Grant and a measuring tape fashioned from cord knotted at inch intervals. He did not bring Bet. He did not bring his pride. Just the notebook, the cord, and an expression as close to humble as Garrett Foss had ever worn in his life. This was not the same man who had ridden past her fence line back in September, pronouncing his judgment about winter's disregard for careful walls. That version of Garrett carried the settled assurance of someone who has done a thing long enough to confuse routine with understanding. The version standing on her doorstep had spent 3 days wrestling with the difference between a wall that fights cold and a wall that stores warmth. The wrestling had cracked something open in his certainty, and the crack was to his credit. He remained Garrett Foss, stubborn, practical, blunt, constitutionally hostile to unnecessary feeling. But he had come with a notebook, and for a man like him,
Arriving with a notebook
was the only shape humility could take. Quote 17, he asked. Quote 18. Quote 19. Quote 20. She let him measure it himself. She understood that men like Garrett Foss must put their own hands on a thing before they can trust it exists. He measured. Quote 21. She told him. Clay drawn from the creek bank, crushed granite beaten from field stone, dried grass cut fine, mixed with just enough water to make it plastic, packed in layers she called lifts, tamped firm. Each lift left a cure before the next went on. She described the inner board forming the second face of the cavity, nailed onto simple ledges to hold the full 8 inches of fill space open. She showed him the tamping method, the flat-headed mallet, the technique of pressing clay against both surfaces at once so it bonded to log and inner board alike without trapping air. She explained that air pockets in a mass wall are dead space, gaps where the fill refuses to participate in thermal exchange. He wrote everything down, slowly, carefully, the handwriting of a man who did not write often. She watched him and did not make him feel small about it. Quote 22, he said eventually. Quote 23. Quote 24, she said. Quote 25. She picked up a fragment of cured material from near the outer wall. Quote, _26, ___. He held the piece, tested its weight against his palm, nodded once, wrote something else in the notebook. Rolf Vetter arrived 2 days after Garrett, also with a notebook. But he brought a more technical set of questions, shaped by his background in German agricultural building, where similar principles had been applied to root cellars and granary walls with some regularity. He wanted to know about drying time for each lift, how long she waited before adding the next layer, how she knew when the clay had cured properly. She told him that green clay shrinks as it dries. If you pack a new lift on top of undried material, the shrinkage of the lower layer tears the upper layer apart, creates fine cracks, invisible at first, that give moisture a pathway inward, and more critically, give the wall a discontinuity in its thermal mass. Cold spots where none should exist. She had learned this watching her father repair a section of Blackhouse wall near Ullapool. He had packed it too quickly one summer, developed exactly that pattern of hairline fractures. Rolf studied the wall section she described and understood it immediately, in the language of materials his own hands already knew. He made notes about waiting time between lifts. Quote, _27, she told him, and about the importance of covering completed sections with cloth or bark to slow drying slightly in direct sun, preventing the surface from hardening too fast while the center remained wet. Fast-drying clay skins over, looks solid, but underneath it stays soft, and the hard shell traps moisture, prevents proper curing from ever reaching the core. Slow, uniform drying through the full 8 inches of depth, that was what mattered. And she had managed it by shielding fresh sections from the hard afternoon sun. Rolf's eldest boy, Hans, 14 years old, carried with him that particular intensity you see in young people when new information lands on something already growing inside them. He asked whether you could apply the same method to a cabin already standing and lived in. The question caught Nora slightly off guard, not because it missed the mark, because it struck the center of it. The exact practical question she had been waiting for someone to reach. Yes, she said, harder in winter. The clay won't cure right in cold air. But in spring, March, April, before next winter arrives, you could mount the inner boards, mix the fill dry, pack it loose, then seal it in warm weather so it cures through summer before the frost returns. Hans wrote this down on a separate page from his father's notes, folded it carefully, and slid it into his jacket pocket. Nora said nothing about this, but she saw it. Clara Whitmore came alone. No Daniel. A day in late January when the cold had pulled back to something merely miserable rather than deadly. She sat at Nora's table with a cup of mint tea, brewed from dried leaves Nora had stored in a tin all winter. She was quiet for a while before she spoke what she had come to speak. May hasn't coughed since we left here, Clara said. Not once. The whole ride home I kept waiting for it to start. It never did. Nora nodded. She'd been coughing since November. I thought it was the season. I didn't think cold was pushing through the walls. I thought Daniel had built them well, and that was sufficient. She looked down at her hands on the table. He did build them well, for what they are. Nora said nothing about what they were. She poured more tea. He wants to know if you'll teach him, Clara said. Come spring. He's already planning to drag clay from the creek before the ground locks up again. Store it dry, so the material's ready when the weather turns. Tell him to haul twice what he thinks he'll need, Nora said. It's always more than you expect. Another silence. Then Clara spoke quietly. I came to say thank you. You don't need to, Nora said. It was soup. Clara laughed. A short, startled sound, half tears behind it. It wasn't the soup, Nora. I know, Nora said, but it's the sort of thing worth saying. The community's relationship with Nora Kearn shifted after January of 1875. Not loudly, not with any announcement, but anyone paying close attention could feel it. The mockery did not transform into praise. It was more that the specific energy behind the mockery dissolved. In its place settled a quieter thing, respectful curiosity. Men who had spent months calling her wall Project Nora's Folly or the Scotswoman's Hobby appeared in spring carrying notebooks. They asked questions with a different quality of attention than before. The difference between asking because you want to win an argument and asking because you genuinely need to know. It has a texture everyone in the room can feel. What moved through the settlement that spring and into the following summer was not a formal technique, not a school of practice. It was closer to an understanding. The communal recognition that the principles Nora had applied,
were not exotic.
not foreign, simply ancient. The accumulated logic of people who had built for brutal climates across centuries, long before the American frontier decided that speed and simplicity were the only virtues worth honoring. Scottish Blackhouse construction was the tradition Nora could name. But the same principle had been applied by cliff-dwelling peoples in the American Southwest with their adobe and rammed earth, by Norse builders layering stone and turf, by the peoples of the Siberian steppe packing structures with sod and compressed earth, by every cold climate building tradition that had survived long enough to learn what dense walls actually do. What all of them knew, and what standard frontier chinking emphatically did not, was the difference between keeping cold out and storing warmth in. Stated simply,
The distinction sounds subtle.
it is enormous in practice, especially at 38 below zero, with a sleeping child in the corner and a fire that cannot outrun the cold pressing through a thin wall toward everything you love, every single bore. By the summer of 1875, Daniel Whitmore had made 7 separate trips to haul clay from the creek. He stored it under canvas in his barn, shielding it from freezing through the mild nights. He had adopted Nora's inner board technique and sketched his own diagram, which he brought to Nora for review. She corrected 3 details, told him the rest was exactly right. August and September he spent packing his walls. Evenings after fieldwork, Clara mixing the composite in the trough beside him. The children carried loads back and forth.
10 weeks it took,
Slightly faster than Nora's 11, because he had her instructions to follow rather than inherited memory to draw from. Rolf Vetter committed to a full repacking of his north and west walls, the 2 that caught the prevailing winter wind. He used a modified mix, swapping a portion of crushed granite for broken river cobble, which he had in greater supply. He had written to a German builder in New Ulm, who confirmed the principle was sound. The claystone composite was a recognized technique in traditional German construction. This gave Rolf something useful. What Nora had been doing carried a name in German, Lehmwand, and had been practiced across Central Europe for no fewer than 300 years. He reported this at the settlement's next church gathering with the particular satisfaction of a man who has found documented proof for something he already believed. Nobody raised the obvious question.
if it had worked in Germany for 3 centuries,
Why had everyone waited for Nora to carry it to Minnesota? But that question was likely too uncomfortable to speak aloud. Garrett Foss spent the summer constructing a separate root cellar using a variant of the method. Thick clay stone walls, dense, uniform, designed to hold a stable temperature through winter cold and summer heat alike. He did not repack his own cabin walls until the following spring. Time had run out in 1875, but he told Nora the root cellar performed exactly as she had described. Stable temperature through both extremes. No additional insulation. No fire. And this convinced him more deeply than the blizzard had. The blizzard he had partly dismissed as exceptional circumstances. The root cellar worked in ordinary conditions. That meant the principle was reliable, not just spectacular. He did not say any of this to Nora directly. He said it to Rolf. Rolf told Marta.
Marta mentioned it
To Clara Whitmore. Clara eventually told Nora. This was roughly how information moved through the settlement, and Nora did not mind the indirection. The acknowledgement reached her. That was enough. The second winter, 1875 into 1876, was not as brutal as the first. Cold snaps arrived, serious but brief. The families who had repacked their walls the previous summer noticed the difference. Appreciable, but not dramatic. They burned less wood, maintained more even temperatures, woke to warmer mornings. The test conditions were not as extreme, so the margin was not as stark. This is the nature of thermal mass. Its advantage shows most clearly at the extremes. In a mild winter, a clay stone wall and a well-chinked log wall will both keep a family warm. The comparison is merely one of comfort and fuel savings. When the cold drops to 38 below and holds for 3 days, the comparison becomes one of survival. The Whitmore family spent their second winter in a cabin Daniel had repacked to Nora's specifications. May Whitmore did not cough once from November through March. Clara wrote about this to her mother in Ohio in language that made it sound nearly miraculous, attributing the child's health to the steady warmth, the absence of cold drafts that had defined their first winter indoors. The letter found its way to an Ohio newspaper through Clara's mother, who had a habit of passing along correspondence she found compelling. A short paragraph about the Scottish widow's clay wall construction appeared in print during the spring of 1876. It described the technique as a notable frontier innovation with practical value for any settler building in cold climates. Nora didn't see the clipping until months later. A cousin of Rolf Vetter's, weighing the possibility of a Minnesota homestead, had sent it north with a letter asking whether anyone in the settlement could direct him to this woman's claim. Rolf, barely containing the satisfaction of a man whose community had been recognized in print, delivered the clipping to Nora himself. She read it, standing in her doorway, then folded it, handed it back. Her face gave nothing. Calm, composed, a closed door. Rolf asked. She said. Rolf offered. Nora said. She stepped back inside, and through the window, Rolf could see her stacking firewood for the evening with the same unhurried steadiness she brought to every task her hands touched. Outside, the May wind swept in off the river. The clay stone walls of her cabin, darkened by absorbed seasons, stood solid and patient in the afternoon light. They held their warmth the way all dense things hold warmth. Quietly, entirely, and far longer than anyone who hadn't pressed a palm against them might think possible. The legacy Nora Kearn left in that Minnesota river valley was not built from grand gestures or celebrated moments. It lived in walls. By 1880, 7 of the 12 claims in her immediate settlement used some variation of the clay stone packing method in their construction, each adapted to available materials and family resources. Some leaned heavier on stone, lighter on clay. Some mixed in wood chips when grass ran scarce. Some managed only 5 or 6 inches of packed depth, where 8 would have served better. None matched the thoroughness of Nora's original work. Because Nora had given 11 weeks to something most people gave 2, that gap in devotion produced a gap in result. But the principles held across every variation. and every family that repacked its walls arrived at the same practical truth. They burned less wood. They stayed warmer through the night. They did not find themselves in crisis when extreme cold arrived without warning. The broader principle that a home's architecture can store warmth rather than merely resist cold is one that modern building science has codified with considerable precision. Thermal mass is a defined quantity in contemporary construction standards. High-mass wall systems in cold climates are now understood to provide time-lag benefits. They reduce peak heating demands. They moderate overnight temperature drops. Dense earthen and mineral materials, clay, stone, adobe, rammed earth, appear in current sustainable building literature with specific formulas. Formulas for calculating